What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God Almighty at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am blessed to serve you as host. First and foremost, I am a Christian. God has blessed me in life to be military, law enforcement, private contractor, professional big game hunter and guide, and many other things. It's going to be a short bio, guys. I'm going to be honest, I had a whole other episode that I wanted to record. It was a long night. Got off the Alaska ferry. Supposed to be I'm just talking with you guys. You guys are the tribe, right? If this is your first episode you've listened to, you're probably like, what? Skip forward a couple minutes. Anyway, got off the Alaska ferry last night on a new location in Alaska, southeast Alaska. Hopefully be able to get some more hunting in. I thought we'd get in around 2. That means get into where we're going to stay, spend the night, sleep. Delays with the ferry things. It ended up being like 5 in the morning, and the wife also works remote, and she ended up having to get up at like 7:30. So I'm a bit tired. I think that the original episode, which is going to be the impact of Civil War II on America, that is a weighty topic. Not that today's one isn't, but I think that is going to require more cognitive function to do it correctly than I can give you. That was this morning, and right now there was a lot going on. My wife is actually flying across the country, so there was unpacking and repacking and stuff. It's like 9:30 at night. I got some admin stuff done earlier with the podcast, but first recording of the day, 9:30 at night after a few hours of sleep. So hopefully you will give me a pass on that. But if the impact of Civil War 2.0 on America interests you, make sure you're liked, subscribe, following the show. It'd be a blessing to have you as a follower, as a listener, a regular listener. So hopefully you are those things. Let's get into today's topic. You probably know because you probably clicked on it unless it auto-played. Knife fighting in 2023. What? Why? Who? How? So we're going to tackle today on Alpha Male Podcast. Now, I'm primarily a gunfighter. I'm the host of Gunfighter Life. That is the podcast that by far does the best out of these podcasts. I've been a professional gunfighter most of my adult life, as you might deduce from the bio. But I do have some knife fighting training. I would say quite a bit more than the average person, but I would not call myself an expert in it. I do have some real-world martial application in knife defense, knife fighting. I also competed in knife and hatchet throwing. That was mostly just for funsies, but I have competed in that in the past. Knife and hawk throwing. But most of my bladed and edge weapons comes from like hand-to-hand grappling and military adjacent type training. I do the vast majority of my training with a handgun for good reason, which brings us to the why. Like, especially if America, right? Like, just went to the store to get something for tomorrow's hunt, and I was packing a 6-hour M17 Trijicon RMR, normal capacity magazines, a 17 and a 21. Why? Why even talk about knife fighting? I just did a whole episode on like a well-rounded knife battery, and I specifically didn't talk about specific fighting knives because I was thinking of doing this episode. Kind of a niche thing. I'm not going to bury the lead here. I think firearms are more effective than knives. What major army today equips their frontline infantry with swords or with Dirks or Daggers and has them run into battle against machine guns? Nobody, right? That would be foolish. What police agency, if they're just so anti-gun like the UK or Britain, sends their cops out without being armed? Like, you don't need a gun. Here is a K-bar. Like the K-bar, by the way. We'll probably talk about the K-bar. Carried one in war. But, right? No, they don't do that. They don't even say, hey, grunt, which is a term for infantryman, which I was one. Infantryman, Marine Corps, combat veteran. They don't say, hey, Fix your bayonet because the bayonet is so effective. Then if you break your bayonet, go ahead and rack that charging handle and use firepower. No, right? The gun is more effective. Even a handgun, which is inherently less effective than a rifle and a shotgun, is still, in a lot of cases, it's superior to a knife. Again, most of the time. So, I guess when we talk about a knife is many things. A knife is a tool, one of man's early and most used tools throughout history. Whether that's a knapped, sharpened piece of flint, one intentionally shaped into a more prominent blade profile, or one that was attached to a piece of wood or bone and lashed together with pine resin and sinew or some kind of natural cordage, and on and on. We've been using these things for so long, and we've almost certainly been using them for defense for probably almost as long as we've had them. Why is that? Because they're a force multiplier primarily, and secondarily, not as much as a firearm, but they're a way to project force farther. Have quite a bit of fighting experience, mostly hand-to-hand. You know, when they talk about boxing, there's a reason they will give the reach of this boxer versus that boxer. Why? Because that matters, right? That ability to project force a little bit farther, that can, not always, but it can make a difference. That can be an advantage. If you talk about a blade, especially a blade of any substantial size, the force that you would normally be able to apply, you can apply it farther out. That's a real thing. But mostly, it is a great force multiplier, meaning the damage that I can do, and you can kill a man with your bare hands, with your feet. You can do it. Many, many people, even today, are killed by hands and feet. They're choked to death. They're stomped to death. That was one of the killing blows we first learned in the Marine Corps, hand-to-hand, was how to kill somebody in such a manner. But it's a lot easier with a weapon. That's why we have them. The amount of damage I can do with a fist can be fatal. And I'm not even saying that fatality should always be your goal, right? Proportional force is a thing. But I'm trying to get a point across here, is that if I applied the same amount of pressure hitting you in the face, that's bad. If I now have a blade of any substantial size or quality, if I hit you in the face with that same amount of force, that's a tremendous, not a little marginal, a tremendous force multiplier. It's a tremendous force multiplier. So when we look at it that way, men, just because I don't think it's your best option doesn't mean it's not still a force multiplier. Kind of the what the knife can do for you. And I said that the firearm, and especially for most Americans that generally will carry a handgun, I said usually, and this will get into the when, I guess, but usually the firearm is a better option. Now, I was the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters. To stop active shooters here in America, CONUS, a large metropolitan area. As part of that, we did a ton of shooting. We also did a little bit of grappling, ground fighting, because a lot of fights end up on the ground. You can't just, again, proportional force. Even if the guy was a lethal threat and then somehow negated, like he just killed two people with a lead pipe, and you get up there and he drops the lead pipe, but he still wants to throw down, you still got to go hands-on with that guy. You can't just shoot him. This is not how that works. Not legally, not justifiably. Not in America. You might argue whether it's just or not, but it's not legal here. So a lot of times you'll have to go hands-on. Also, perhaps the subject got so close to you, your adversary got so close to you before you realized it, or before there was any deadly force. Not even in the professional arena. You're not the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters, but you're at 7-Eleven pumping gas, you get distracted, you turn around, and there's some guy right up in your grill. He's close. And then the fight's on before you can grab your gun. In any of those scenarios, even if you have a handgun, you may not be able to access it. There is a reason that I usually, the vast majority of the time, will carry handgun, dominant side, for me right-handed, 3 o'clock, hip, carry on the belt line. For a lot of reasons, but then here's where it ties into the knife. I will carry a fixed blade knife suitable for defense on my left side pocket so that I have a defensive option on either side. Let's say I'm pinned against a wall. Wall wrestling, wall fighting is a thing, is a tactic, is a technique, pinning somebody against a wall. Let's say I'm pinned in that scenario pumping gas. What if I'm pinned in between the door jamb and the car door, and that arm is literally pinned down and I can't access the gun? Could I potentially access that knife to make space and create time and opportunity to get away and or access that firearm? If I'm wrestling and the dude has my arm pinned behind my back because I did some kind of poor maneuver or I was outnumbered or whatever, and my firearm arm is pinned behind me and the other one can't reach it because I'm literally laying on the gun with a couple of 100 pounds of angry dude pounding my head into the ground, I just can't access that gun. Can I access that knife, again, to make space? Also, I am in extreme close quarters. I have done quite a bit of extreme close quarters gunfighting techniques, handgun, rifle, things like that. If my gun malfunctions, and I'm, again, down to one hand because I'm fighting, in that scenario, and you should learn, and I do learn, to clear malfunctions with one hand only, with either hand only. But in that moment, might it be a smarter thing to go for the knife? I think it's a good option. It's not always the best option. I would even say the vast majority, it's probably not going to be your go-to, but it is a good alternative option, even if you have a handgun. So I think that there is a real case, if you carry a gun for defense, you ought to be circumspect and consider carrying a suitable knife for defense. Not in place of, not in lieu of, in addition to a fighting handgun. That's a big one. Here's another one. Even here in America, you can't always have a gun, and there are certain situations where you might be able to have a knife that you cannot have a gun. In those situations, guess what? That knife probably became your primary. I've done an episode on improvised weapons. Perhaps I should put that out again. It's been a while. Maybe an improvised weapon is better than a knife, like a cane or a stainless steel water bottle with a nice piece of 550 cord around it to swing it around. Or let's say at the airport and you just have a length of chain with a big beefy padlock to just secure your bag when you get somewhere. It could be a pretty nasty improvised weapon, and you might argue in some cases better than a knife. But sometimes a knife is your best option. Sometimes a knife is just what you're going to have. And also, there's listeners, by God's grace, from all around the world that listen to this podcast. I'm very humbled by that. Not everybody does their government recognize their right to keep and bear arms. It's strange to them, like when I go outside to walk the dog, that I'm strapped. To them, that's not even an option. It's not even the thing they can do. Just a little ways from here. I mean, I'm in Alaska. It's not that far to the Canadian border. Not exactly sure where the line is, but in the daylight, if I went outside, I might be able to see it. But just over there, they're not down with that. And this is, brown bear, black bear, wolf country. But I guess you just better pack a shotgun with slugs, whether it's convenient or not, because the handgun is not an option for you. Anyway, there's a lot of people around the world where just defensive carry day to day is not a real thing. But guess what is still a real thing in all those areas? In the UK, in Canada. Guess what is still a real thing? Violent crime. Homicide. Manslaughter. Rape. Mayhem. Assault with a deadly weapon. Those things are still going on. You think there's no murders in the UK? Look at the UK murder rate. Does it really matter to you if somebody to murder you with a gun or a lead pipe? you should still have a way to defend yourself. And you should, I think, as a man, have some hand-to-hand combat skills. I think the knife adds on to those skills. Again, it's a force multiplier. It's not a security blanket. You can't just grab the knife and start sucking your thumb and expect people to run away. You should train with it, and I think the foundation of that should be hand-to-hand combat. I'm getting off topic here. There are a lot of areas where you may not be able to have a firearm. In that case, a knife may be a good option and a good primary option to defend oneself. Ergo, when a fighting knife in 2023 may come into the equation. Okay, so I guess now we're going to talk about what is a fighting knife. And really anything can be a fighting knife. Because pretty much any metal instrument that you hold can be a force multiplier. For instance, if I'm trying to fight for my life against an adversary, and it's literally a fight to the death, and all I have is my hands, and you offer me a butter knife, a dull butter knife, I would take it because it's a force multiplier. Is it a great fighting knife? No, but if I'm fighting with it, it's a fighting knife, and it's way better than no knife. If you said you can have only the butter knife handle, I'd still take it. It's still a force multiplier. So really any object, any sharp, pointy, or either sharp or pointy object can be a fighting knife. But I think you get what I'm saying when there are more ideal fighting knives. The first one I'm not going to talk about is karambits. Karambit is a very specialized fighting style that the speaker here knows very little about. And I'll be honest, I'm a little dubious about it. I don't think I will ever really pursue it. Because from my training and experience and what I have observed and can deduce, it's actually the stabbing and the puncturing, more so than the slashing, that actually gets the most real-world firsthand results. And karambit focuses on the other. Not that you can't stab with a karambit knife, you can, but they're mostly meant for slashing and all kinds of, it's a very specialized thing. And again, I'm not going to talk something I don't know. I'm dubious about it. That doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It is not a style that I have ever felt the compulsion to pursue. And to me, in my mind, that leaves two other big camps. The Dirks and Daggers, and the combat utility knives. I guess I'll start off with the one that I have the most experience with, and that is the combat utility knife. I mentioned that U.S. Marine Corps Infantry Grunt, 0351 Assaultman. That's an MOS that no longer exists, but did carry a K-bar, did carry one in the war, did carry one in combat. I also carried various bayonets, and even would sometimes opt for some of my own knives. And I had quite a bit of training in K-bar and bayonet fighting. Sadly, the Army, I also served in the U.S. Army after the Marine Corps. Sadly, the Army got rid of training soldiers, even infantrymen. They stopped training them on bayonets, which I think is a little strange. But I'm not going to sit here and criticize the U.S. Army on that. But anyway, I have the most training in utility and combat knives. And you quintessentially think of, at least I do, maybe because I'm a Marine, but I think a lot of Americans and people around the world would think of the K-bar. And the K-bar, as I understand its history, was an adaptation of a large hunting knife. K-bar, I believe, is like shorthand for kill a bear. I have a bit of experience with the K-bar. But in modern warfare, knife fighting is a last-ditch effort. I think a good warrior should know how to use hand-to-hand combat, should know how to use a knife. But you're in a bad place if you've gotten to your knife. It has happened. It has happened in the global war on terror in that 20 years. There have been instances of edged weapons coming into play. It's a rarity. I still think you should be ready for it if you consider yourself an alpha male. That said, a lot of the time they're used for utility. I don't know if they still teach this, but when I was in, they taught us how to clear You can search for landmines, for instance, with your K-bar or bayonet. That's an actual thing. That's a practice. Hopefully that is not used much anymore. But it's a utility fighting knife. The K-bar is a good combat knife, but it is a dual purpose, I believe, utility / combat knife. And I think a lot of these big knives are. You look at kind of what you might think of, and I'm not a historian, right? But what we commonly think of here in America, which I think was an adaptation of an earlier European knife form, the Bowie knife or Bowie knife. It's a big utility knife. Is it a formidable combat weapon, hand to hand? Yeah, it sure is. But it's also a good utility knife. You know, most Marines use their K-bars for not actual combat most of the time. They use it for more pedestrian tasks. There's a limit to how much stuff you can have. And a good crossover utility combat knife is a good thing. A couple of modern utility combat knives may also be a bayonet, like the M9 bayonet, the new U.S. Marine Corps bayonet, which I was issued right at the tail end of me getting out, which is a formidable, good bayonet and a very good combat utility knife. You go back to the older, I believe it's the M7 bayonet. The one before that, I was issued that one first. Actually a decent, it's kind of the bayonet version of a Mark III fighting knife, which I think is actually a really good combat knife. Probably more towards that combat line and that fighting knife line than utility. If you look at it, it's pretty thin, but again, a lot of the casualties caused in actual knife altercations are from stabbing. And when you're stabbing, a thin knife like that Mark III fighting knife has a lot of advantage. The Mark III, that's kind of where I draw the line at a utility and fighting knife. That one's more towards the fighting knife side, but also utility blade. But you also have, again, the K-bar is probably the most famous. You have the SOG Seal Pups. We had those in theater, and I would sometimes carry it rather than the K-bar. I would often carry the K-bar, but sometimes I would just carry a more traditional hunting knife, and I would carry it, either one of those I would generally carry in my armor on my chest so that if I was ground fighting, I could reach it with either hand. Sometimes I would just carry what you might consider a fairly ordinary fixed blade 3 to 4 inch utility knife that would also be good for a combat knife. There's also their Gerber Strong Arm, the Gerber LMF, the Air Force survival knife. That's, actually I think a pretty good design. Those are all what I would consider your combat utility kind of fighting knives. Then you have your dedicated Dirk or Dagger fighting knives. Kind of the epitome that you would think of this is going to be, a Dirk or Dagger. As I understand it, as I remember it from my time in law enforcement, I was a police officer, depending on your jurisdiction. But in general, a dagger is sharpened on both sides, and a Dirk is sharpened on one side. But a Dirk or a Dagger, these are generally going to be thinner, narrower. Another a couple more iconic ones of these are the Fairbairn Sykes. That might be the most iconic, the Fairbairn Sykes. And then the Fairbairn Applegate is kind of a beefier, if you want to call it that, version of that. There's also the Gerber Mark I and Mark II. You'll see a lot of similarities here. And any kind of those boot knife style, dagger style, you'll see a lot of similarities here, whether it's a Dirk or a Dagger, but primarily they're long, thinnish blades of varying thicknesses, but you can tell when you look at them, or you should be able to deduce, they're meant for stabbing. That's their primary thing is stabbing. Of course, you will learn, if you learn any kind of knife fighting, you'll learn parries, you will learn slicing the hand to disarm an attacker. You learn all kinds of things, but primarily they're stabbers. They're a stabbing implement. A sleek, thin profile lends itself well to stabbing. And again, that's a or I should say probably the most effective, most often knife fatality. You can slice somebody so bad that they bleed to death. That may or may not come too late to actually save you. But in general, again, my training and experience, I believe that stabbing is the most effective. These knives are kind of meant for stabbing. You can stab somebody with a K-bar. You certainly can. It's a big, nasty knife, and it'll get the job done. I guess a way to put it is something like the Fairbairn Sykes or their Gerber Mark II. It's a more elegant weapon. It's certainly not for more civilized, but it's more of an elegant, precise weapon. And the amount of force to insert that blade will be less than something like a big combat utility knife. But what you give up is the robustness of the bigger combat utility knife. So you're losing quite a bit of the utility. Not that you can't do utility stuff with a Fairbairn Sykes. If you look at a Fairbairn Sykes next to a K-bar, you'll easily be able to discern, I think, the difference. One is going to be a better brute force utility tool, and one is a more, let's say, purpose-driven stabbing implement. And I'm talking like modern fighting. If you look at the Fairbairn Sykes, if you look at the Fairbairn Applegate or the Gerber Mark I, Mark II, they're just a really classic design. You see these, I've said this before, you see these going all throughout history. You see them ancient Egypt. You see them in Rome and the Pugio. I still remember a little bit of Latin. I did take Latin. Sorry, I never took ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian. Any of the old Greek that I know is mostly to do with the Bible and not to do with blades. But the Pugio in Latin, but you see it in many civilizations. You see it over and over again. If you look at a Roman Pugio and you look at a Fairbairn Applegate, right, except for probably better modern metallurgy and maybe different handle materials, from a practical standpoint, I think there's a lot more in common than there is separating those. And you're talking about over centuries of combat culture. The fact that reemerges would highly suggest, in fact, it would be almost illogical to think that all these cultures came up with this same blade style over and over again throughout the centuries if it wasn't an effective fighting knife. So I guess that's the big bifurcation that I see in modern knives. Do you want a purpose-driven? Do you want more of a dual purpose? Because as I alluded to, even a Marine Corps infantryman, the vast majority of the time he's going to use a blade, it's going to be for the utility side. Hopefully. Marines are pretty hardcore, but I think any honest Marine would tell you that he opens more MREs than he gets in knife fights. I don't uses a K-bar for many other things. But you get the idea there. And I think most people, hopefully, even less in the combat role. That said, there's nothing wrong with those Dirks or Daggers. If that's your primary defensive option, maybe you decide you want the best tailor-made tool for the job, and I wouldn't fault you for that. The Dirk is basically a similar design, but sharpened on one edge. You'll see, you might, and I'm not as familiar with Japanese styles, all my martial arts experience, except for what's crept in MMA. So that, for me, is Western. But the Japanese, if you look at their fighting knife, talking about their small, thin one, it's like that Japanese Tanto blade, but it's pretty much a Dirk. It's a thin stabbing, it'll slice too, narrow, good for stabbing implement. There are some real advantages to having a double-edged blade. There are some real advantages to having a single-edged blade. And I'd say it's 50-50. A double-edged blade, obviously you can cut in both directions. That's a big advantage. But you can't put your other hand on the back side of the blade to shove down on it to cut deeper. You can't choke your hand up on the blade to do fine cutting work. For instance, I hope to, by God's grace tomorrow, be stalking beasts in the Alaska wilderness. If I slay said beast and I go to butcher it, I don't want a double-edged dagger for that. I want to choke up on the blade and basically like a clip point, but I like to put my finger right at the edge of that blade and reach up in there and cut out the heart and the liver because they're delicious. But also remove the stuff that I don't want to eat, like the lungs and things like that, the offal. Could I do that with a Farabaran Sykes? Could I do that with a double-edged dagger? I could, but it's not going to be as precise and it's not going to be as good for the job. Also, if it gets really cold and the meat freezes, again, I can put my hand on the backside of a single-edged knife and push down, which also has fighting application. If I do that on a double-edged dagger, I'm going to equally cut myself as the adversary. So again, you see, I'm hard-pressed between the two. If you're talking crossover utility, then the single edge gets it. But you see that double-edged dagger come back again and again throughout history. If you look at, just a tangent here, if you look at the Mark III fighting knife kind of style, it's kind of a 3/4. The front part is like a double-edged dagger, and the back part has a portion where you can put your hand on the back of the blade. That Mark III fighting knife, and again, that later iteration, I think it's the bayonet that looks very much like a Mark III fighting knife that you attach to the end of your rifle that I learned bayonet fighting on. I think there's a good reason for that design as well. But if you look at that, it's very much a thin dirk dagger, except for it being a bayonet with a stacked leather handle. It's very classic in design. I reckon if you gave that to a Roman legionnaire sometime in the BC, he might be perplexed over the way it was constructed, but I imagine he'd know how to fight with it. I imagine his training in his dirk or dagger would cross over to those kind of knives. Again, they're classic. So I guess to put up the tray tables and bring this episode in for a landing, are fighting knives still relevant in 2023? Yes. Can pretty much any pointy or sharp object be used as a fighting knife? Yes, it can. But are there much better and kind of timeless, classic fighting knives? Yes. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. But a knife, just like a gun, is not a security blankie. You can't be really scared and put your hand on your knife and suck your thumb and curl up in a ball and expect bad people to go away. Any warrior knows the value of training, and they know that it's more important than this steel versus that steel, or this polymer striker-fired handgun versus that polymer striker-fired handgun, or is it a 3.5-inch blade or a 4-inch blade? Is it a K-bar or a Gerber LMF? Is it a SOG Pentagon, right? If you have some hand-to-hand combat knife fighting experience, it's going to be vastly more relevant than subtle differences in blade shape and metallurgy. Anyway, maybe a little bit scattered, but hopefully useful and intriguing and entertaining in a good way episode on fighting knives. I thought it should probably get its own episode. I hope to do a knife nerd out episode. I don't know if I'll talk about all these terms, but something along the lines of, a clip point versus a drop point versus a spear point versus a tanto. What really is stainless steel? What is 1095? Which one is better for me in my life? What about the Super Steels S30V or N690 or Magna Cut? What's the deal with those? Are they worth it? Something like that, like a knife nerd out episode. Locking mechanisms, you're talking about a folding knife, all that stuff. If that interests you, again, hopefully you're following the show, liking the show. subscribed, whatever vernacular they use on whatever platform you're listening to. Also, again, I want to do that Civil War 2.0 impact on America. Anyhow, men, I am very humbled that you listen. I'm humbled that you give me some of your time. I realize I was a bit tired tonight. I am humbled that you give me some of your time, and I am very thankful and humbled, and you should be too, by the patrons that step up and support this podcast. I don't take sponsors. I'm not telling you to buy a Benchmade because Benchmade gives me a bunch of free Benchmades or whatever. If you enjoy this podcast, thank God first and foremost, because we couldn't do anything without him, and I know that. And then after that, thank the patrons. They do a lot so you guys can listen to this show on the regular, and I'm thankful to them. If you want to become one of them, get some insider content, insider chat, things like that, consider becoming a patron. There should be a link in the show notes. Enough of that. Your tactical tip and then tactical verse of the day. Now, your tactical tip of the day. You know what's not a great fighting knife? A surgical scalpel. But they are really sharp. And they are really handy. And you can generally get them in a sterile package. And you can put them, if you're so inclined, usually behind your cell phone case, between your cell phone and the inside of the cell phone case. If you forget your blade, or you're trying to remove a foreign object from you or somebody else and you want a good, sterile, really sharp blade, you have another really good sharp blade. Also, non-permissive environments, or if something were to happen and your primary blade was gone for whatever reason, you might still have that blade. Those surgical scalpels, put them in different places. You could put one in your wallet. I've done that before, but generally in the cell phone case, between the cell phone case and the cell phone. They're super thin, super sharp. They don't weigh very much. Why not have one in there? That's your tactical tip of the day. Your tactical verse of the day. You might be thinking of Luke. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Great verse. I guess that'll be a bonus, but not one that I'm thinking of. Exodus 15, the Lord is a man of war. That's a great one. Still not the one I was thinking of for today. And David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord stand between the earth and the heaven, having a drawn sword in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem. The Lord is a man of war. David, a man after God's own heart, was a man of war. We see here God's angel with a sword. There is no contradiction in being a warrior and being a man of God. I see no contradiction. I don't know how you could make that argument from Scripture saying that a Christian cannot be armed. There's a proper time and a place to use force. I will certainly grant that, and it is a great blessing and a gift of God's wisdom to be slow to anger. But going back to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells his disciples to have swords. Swords are fighting weapons. You could cut bread with them. Probably make a charcuterie board with a sword. I don't know. I've never done it. But they're a weapon of war. They're a defensive/offensive fighting blade. Anyway, some food for thought. The use of force against another person is a weighty, heavy matter. Be slow to anger. And make sure you have a good biblical foundation for when force is and is not just. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.